Thank you very much, Susan, and everyone else for staying for the second session. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm going to basically start by addressing the question that Susan asked last night, which is how much longer can the regime survive? And here's what I would like to argue. When you have an economic crisis of this proportion, you never know whether what's in greater danger is the regime itself and its authoritarian practices, or what's left of democracy in Venezuela. In other words, it seems that there are two possible dying bodies here, the regime and the few democratic spaces that are still left. And so the question is, which one will die first? And it's a complicated question, and I would like to offer some thoughts. Let me begin by summarizing why one would argue that the regime is going to survive, actually, that it is actually going to continue the trend that it has pursued, which is a deepening of autocracy, or at least deepening enough in order to be able to regain control. And then I'm going to try to be a bit more optimistic and say, well, you know, democracy might nonetheless still survive. So I'm going to end up with that optimism note. But first, on the pessimism. It is absolutely clear to me as a political scientist that under Chavez and absolutely under Nicolás Maduro, the regime, which is considered a competitive authoritarian regime, has become less competitive electorally and consequently more authoritarian. Unable to win the large number of votes it used to get, it has resorted more and more to authoritarian forms of control. And they're very evident, just as we saw in the previous panel that the signs of a rising hyperinflation are evident to economists. For me as a political scientist, they're also very evident. Let me just mention three items. Number one, the panel before mentioned it, the desire to control prices. The very famous 2014 organic law of fair prices is the closest thing I have seen in Latin America, outside of Cuba, of a model of trying to run an economy as a command economy. You not only have control, price controls, but you also have the ban on profits. There are limits to your profits. The law also contemplates sanctioning people who spread rumors, misinformation that may lend itself to speculation. So with a law like this one, you basically have all that you need to go after not just political activists, but now economic agents, and bringing the country to close to a command economy, legally at least. Second, there is a rise in militarism. It's also very evident. You're going to say, you know, Chavez was the biggest military guy. He's the one who brought the military back into Venezuelan politics, and that is true. But Nicolás Maduro has deepened that trend in a way that if you think that you always want to have civilian supremacy and oversight of the military, you got to wonder. Under Chavez, the military felt grateful to Chavez. Under Maduro, it is Maduro who feels grateful to the military, and that's a very different relationship. So what he has done is let me just give you one statistic. I don't know how many missions Maduro has created. I don't think that many, but he created one mission for the military. And that gives you a sense of how he is trying to reward them and maybe pay back. And so the military has been given further and further control to the economy, and especially the role of supervising prices, which is absolutely dramatic. And finally, the role of hegemonía comunicacional. Again, these are the ways in which the regime has turned more autocratic and in many ways trying to overwhelm what's left of a private life in Venezuela. I did a little assessment of what's happening in the balance between independent media and public or pro-government media over the years. And I have more detailed numbers, but the evidence is absolutely clear. Let me just begin by saying, let's just work with newspapers. In Venezuela, in 1998, when Chavez, before Chavez, there were a large number of newspapers. All of them were private, all of them. And they might have had their orientation, but to our knowledge, they didn't engage in systematic censoring. They might have, newspapers all have their biases. The issue is, do you censor stories of any kind? And there is no evidence of that in a large scale. Today, what has happened is that the government has essentially reduced the size of the private independent newspapers size. And one of the pie charts shows that today it's down to 55%. And we see public state-owned newspapers. You know, that's the Cuban model. Nobody does that, and Maduro loves this idea. He has said that he wants to have a state-owned newspaper in every town of Venezuela, and it's going to be free of charge. That's the way that he sees it. And we all know that the other tactic employed by the government is to force newspapers, independent newspapers, into bankruptcy and then produce a change in ownership and then begin the process of censoring information. I have the data for all of newspapers. I am working on the TV channels, and we have some signs of what's happening with radio. But the story is essentially, if you are a Venezuelan who does not operate in the online world, you have no more freedom of information because the media is now susceptible to this hegemonía comunicacional, which is the official name of this policy. We owe that name to none other than Chavez, but we owe its full implementation or its deepening of implementation to Maduro. So, you know, this is pretty serious, and in many ways, the government can take advantage of the economic emergency to push forward in these fronts, and consequently, this is seriously bad news for a free and open democratic society. So now, let me turn to a little bit about why I think there could still be some hope. And I am, again, I don't want to sound too naive. I want you to please understand that I am absolutely worried as a political scientist. This is no joke. I think we're on the verge of, you know, a major turnaround in politics, and it's not easy for me to visualize a positive scenario here. But nevertheless, it's not unimaginable, and let me lay it out for you to some extent. The best hope for the survival of democracy that I see in Venezuela is the strength of the opposition. And let me say a few words about that. I constantly hear, outside of Venezuela, inside of Venezuela, and inside the opposition, argument after argument about why this opposition is ridiculously bad, absolutely not up to the task, missing on every possible opportunity that was handed to them. The level of criticism makes Venezuela almost comparable to, you know, like when Argentines criticize their own country, they have no match. Well, Venezuelans in the opposition are very hard on the opposition. But from a comparative politics point of view, the Venezuelan opposition has achieved a large number of really unusual accomplishments. And it's easy to lose sight of them. And the most important one is to be able to have a degree of unity, to be able to have an electoral coalition. You think that this would be the automatic default, you know, that, you know, you face a common enemy and you unite. But the truth is that in politics, that's not the case. A common enemy produces divisions about strategies and tactics and about what's going to be done after the job is done. So the natural point is to have heated debate about how do you deal with a strong opposition, strong force, a strong rival. And the Venezuelan opposition since 2006, 2007 has managed to bring together an incredibly large array of political actors and to coordinate strategies and to generally come to many more agreements than not. And there are strains here, but these are really remarkable. And just to give you an idea of how remarkable this ability to maintain unity is, let me just give you figures from the rest of Latin America. One way to measure the lack of unity in the rest of Latin America is to look at presidential elections and see how many candidates run and get more than 10% of the vote. Because you want to see, you know, not just trivial candidates, but serious candidates, those who can get 10% of the vote. And in the last, in all of Latin American elections that we have had, in the most recent one, there have been a total of 17, including Venezuela's, and in 13 of them, there were at least 3 candidates running for office in every election. In some cases, such as Colombia in 2014, Costa Rica in 2014, Chile in 2014, Honduras 2013, there were 4 candidates splitting the opposition vote. And even in Peru, there were 5 candidates in 2011 getting more than 10% of the vote. And Venezuela has avoided this. And this is not happenstance. This is the result of effective strategizing, effective deal-making, and some ability to be pragmatic. It's not happening at all times, and this can unravel, but it is important to bear this in mind. So what you see is this unity has allowed the opposition to, despite facing the worst electoral environment possible among democracies, the opposition has steadily increased its relative and absolute standing in the elections. Now, the frustration is that the big prize for the opposition is never attained, which is to beat Chavismos resoundingly. And it hasn't happened. Nevertheless, the recovery of the Venezuelan opposition for Latin American standards is pretty impressive, considering its very low point of 2005, 2006. The other reason why I think there is a little bit of sign of hope is that for the first time since I've been studying Chavismo, you're beginning to see the international reputation of the regime decay a little. We all know that Latin American nations have been reluctant to say anything bad about Chavismo politics in Venezuela. This is a Latin American tradition of trying not to be too critical of other states. It is a very presidentialist tradition. You never want to criticize another president because you don't want to criticize a president for doing something that you myself might need to do at some point. So you are very cautious. And we're not there yet. We're not in a place where Latin American presidents are ready to badmouth the government. But for the first time, you start to see enormous pressures coming from abroad on the Maduro administration. And the Maduro administration is no longer seen as trying to have an alternative model of democracy. Abroad, the Maduro administration is now seen as a pretty unacceptable autocrat, or someone who has made very unacceptable autocratic decisions. And this is a change. It's not a decisive turn, but it is a brand new phenomenon. So you do have a strengthened opposition with the beginning of a decline in the international image of the administration. And so these are, one could argue, that these are economically nasty times, but politically the situation shouldn't be that, shouldn't make you feel that hopeless. Clearly, if I make the argument that the achievements of the opposition were not preordained, in other words, they were human-made, it's the result of strategic actions and anticipating and figuring out how to play this game, clearly can also unravel. They can stop playing that game. They can become tired. They can decide that they don't want to do it anymore out of frustration. And so I don't want to say that this path has a no return aspect to it. On the contrary. Thank you. Just a few more minutes. I have 5 left, but it'll just be a few more. So I want to say is that however impressive it is a brittle accomplishment, it could come undone. The Maduro administration has made the incredibly inexplicable mistake of helping the opposition. If, I'm asked many times, if Maduro, for example, were to do something like this, come up with an adjustment plan, a la previous panel, and approach certain elements of the opposition and say, you know, let's sign a pact of some sort a la Mexico, what you would probably see is a big split on the opposition. And that would be lethal for the opposition. It would be very easy to produce it. But he doesn't do that. He absolutely doesn't do that, which convinces me that he's not only economically deficient, but also politically very pretty clumsy. Because it's not that impossible to create a division of the opposition. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that this unity of the opposition, as impressive as it is, can easily unravel before our very same eyes. The parliamentary elections are going to be probably going to be okay for the opposition. I am not sure that they're going to necessarily win by a landslide. I think it'll be a huge symbolic victory. I think it'll be a major morale booster for the opposition. I don't think that it'll be a morale killer for the government. I think the government is going to react, could easily react to the very, in many ways, in the same way that Obama reacted to the most recent congressional election in the United States, which is like, oh, you know, okay, we'll just ignore the Congress. So it's not going to be the end of Maduro and Madurismo. It will be a major help for the opposition, and so it's great. So the opposition has to make sure that it continues to think smart about making sure that they score a big win there. Those are my remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. One question, you know, with Maduro's recent call for talks with the United States mediated by UNASUR, and of course, the U.S. responded, you know, you don't need a mediator, but I don't know what else the U.S. is going to respond. If such talks, whatever they're about, would occur, would that help split the opposition?
Yes, I think that would. But Otto Reich is going to say more about this, and he has fascinating things to say about it. But let me just say one thing. The big problem, Maduro has tried to make several approachments to the United States. This isn't, he changes his mind, you know, like the Katy Perry song. He's constantly, you know, going from antagonizing to reaching out. There's a big problem. The United States is very concerned. The United States has a demand to make on Venezuela that the Venezuelan government cannot yield, won't yield on, and that is more working opportunities for the DEA in Venezuela. That, I think, is a major concern for the United States, and for reasons that I think we all understand, Maduro is not ready to deliver on that, and that is going to mean that a possible rapprochement with Venezuela is harder than a rapprochement between the United States and Cuba. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Beatrice?
Thank you.